Hey gang, welcome back. It is I, DrBossKey, and I thought I would walk us through my thinking in design and development of the power downer feature in Shmup Creator. So why don't I take us on over there? All right. First and foremost, what the heck is a power downer? All right. So in our game, we basically have power-ups, which control your weapon sets in this particular case. And then now we have a new feature, which is when you press a button, so button 4 on the controller, it basically opens a portal and then it poops out a power downer. So, and if you collect this power downer, then what will happen is that your weapon set will downgrade. So, and the other side of this is that when the camera is moving, it's always center screen, it's always there. And you'll notice when it times out, it has a little, oh, hey, that didn't work the way I expected it to. It should have a little tiny fade out on that. Maybe I missed one of those. Real quick, I'll take a look. There we go. Okay, so and you can see it has a fade out there. So real quick, I'm gonna pause it and see about fixing this bug. All right, and bug fixed. So I just got done making some changes where I did a polish pass to essentially put in the enemy death state. Okay, so why don't I take us on over to our test lab, and I'll walk you through what the feature is. So it's you know, obviously it fits the need of our particular game, and especially with having so many weapons. But I thought, logically speaking, it would be nice to I mean, you could use the same kind of concept for different aspects. So there's some value in that as well. So first and foremost, this is what it looks like. So a couple things that I highly recommend. So one is that turn on grid snapping. So that way you just get similar alignment to all of your different indicators and script logic functions, right? So it just makes it a little bit easier when you come back to something like this. This is your pile of code, and you haven't seen it in a while. You want to basically be able to see some of the design patterns because that'll help you kind of infer again what's going on flow-wise. Also, one of my little tricks that I wind up using quite a bit is that I just have a trigger property, and this trigger property here, it's not connected to anything, but it's set to enemy's HP is less than 1. Doesn't matter because it's not attached to an enemy. And then we have a text object. And the reason why this exists is so the text object doesn't display text in game. And then this gives me my hint. So in this case, this is the power up weapon set down on button press. So because when you go away from something and then you come back, you're going to want to have as many hints as possible as to how it functions. Okay. So let me see here. I'm gonna collect my thoughts. All right, so why don't I just go ahead and maybe walk you through it here. Okay, so it starts over here with a trigger property, and this is actually, let me take a look. Is that true? Ah, yes. Yeah, that is exactly true. So it starts with a trigger property, and this trigger property stays activated in this case because once it's active, we want it to remain active when it's giving the signal to this countdown timer. So and then we go to a countdown timer. In this case, so for us, we want it to only enable the functionality after a very short period of time occurs when you load a level, because we have a level intro, a little ship flies in, and so in our case, this is about a second or so, and then after that second, and this is set to switch mode. Then we come to the button object, and the button object, this will be available in the 1.5.11. So the button object is set to switch mode in this case, always activated. And what that basically means is switch mode allows it to be enabled. Switch mode allows you to enable and toggle. Oh boy, let me try this again. Switch mode lets you turn on and off functionality. So if you have it set to any triggers set to stay activated, once it fires, it can never be turned off anymore after that. But if you set it to switch mode, you can turn it on and off. And so in our game, we have a mode called pacifist mode. And during this mode, we want to turn off the player controls. And since we're plugged into player controls differently than in the normal player object, this allows us to basically disable and then re-enable this. So very important there. And then we set it to always activated, and always activated basically means is that once the button functionality is activated, it can now receive inputs no matter where it's at in the world. Because again, it's a 3D world, right? And the camera moves around a lot of our shmups. And what you wanted to make sure is that even if the camera starts here and then this is all good at the beginning, because the functions don't travel along with you with the camera, then you wanted to make sure that you can still take button inputs even if the camera has moved on. Okay, so and then we have essentially the button logic here. So let's see here. So before I get into the logic, let me step down real quick. So we have basically down here, these are temporary triggers because when I copy and paste these to new levels, this trigger is for pacifist mode. And so what I do is this gets connected to another enemy that is essentially like what I am a fan of doing is that you have a fake enemy, and because you can read whether an enemy is alive, dead, partially, or some alive or some dead, that basically gives you the ability to understand whether or not you have a true or false condition. And then it lets us, you do a couple things where you can check before you do your next piece of logic. All right, so that's just what that is there. And then once that enemy, that fake enemy dies in the world, it triggers a kill condition without score an item, without explosion, because we don't want to contribute to any of those things. And then we have a bool enemy, true or false, we just talked about. And then we have basically a trigger down here. This trigger is set to switch mode, which is important, right? Because switch mode for this means that it can be switched on and off. And then we have a timer. And the important part about timers to think of is timers are like a breaker switch. So when a timer is active, then that activation period will remain for the duration of the timer. And then once that timer duration is expired, then it will no longer produce signals. So it'll switch out, it will switch itself off. So different than a countdown timer where after a period of time, then the signal is then sent. This is the signal keeps being sent until the timer expires and then turns off. So that allows us, in this case, to switch off temporarily the button for input. And we set the timer here to 0.1 seconds, very, very short. And then it stays in an off state until we finish pacifist mode. So we have basically the same setup here. And then in this case, because we only need one toggle in our world, but you could do multiple if you wanted to. But in our case, when pacifist mode is complete, which is just this mode you're in for 30 to 40 seconds on average, and then we do the same thing where we switch it into switch mode, but we play until the end, and then I set the timer to 9,999 seconds, just making sure that it stays active for the rest of the level. Okay, all right, stay with me. I know it's a tough one. Okay, so then what we have here is we have a dummy mover object, right? And let me back up here. And I'm a fan of dummy mover objects because they allow you to do things like attach other entities, mainly enemies and FX particle emitters, to your dummy mover object. And in our case, it's an enemy. And the most important thing here is that it's attached to camera. So this means that the enemy sticks to the camera once it's seen. And in our particular case, you can see here, my camera setup has, because with the scroller, it has an area outside of the main camera that the camera sees. So the orange area, the orange block, this is what's being shown on screen. This is what's being shown off screen. And so I'll show you in the end here how we put all this together and put it into the level. But this is important because you can put things from the start of your level into the border and they can basically carry along with you. There'll be other ways to do this in the future, but this is the way that you have to do it for now. Okay, so let's come back to the logic. Okay, so now what we have is we basically have, this is kind of our core logic here, right? So I'll make sure I don't save this, move this out of the way. Okay, so one of the other things that we needed to solve for is we need to be able to set the amount of power downers that spawn. And we want to make sure that every time you only got one every time you push the button. So, and in order to do that, we come back in here and we have basically a enemy bool condition. And we have from the button input, you can see here, it comes up to a trigger. And this trigger basically says, hey, look at this enemy bool condition. And it says, if the connected to entity state is all alive, then we're going to pass on the signal. And we're going to do a couple things. So one, this is just some temporary text to make sure we got the signal. This is a link to a countdown timer. So we can essentially do a few things. And I'll try to unpack this the best I can. Holy moly. Holy moly, lots of stuff. All right. This out of the way. Definitely do not want to save. Do not save. Okay. Let me explode this a little bit. Get out of here. All right. Okay, cool. It's a little easier to see when it's not all packed together. All right, cool. And we got that there. And we got that there. And we got that there. Okay, cool. There we go. All right. So again, so you have the trigger mode. It's set to switch mode in this case. It checks to say, hey, is this entity alive? If so, then we want to send a signal. So you know, I always recommend putting in little like test inputs, test text inputs, because this will make you confirm that the logic for the signal coming from the trigger actually is there. And so we come down here, and then we basically have a countdown timer that we use. In this one, we're going to say stay activated. The duration is 2 seconds. And then this basically triggers a couple things. So you can also hold the control key down to see, to select things, and you select multiple things, right? So, so one is that it activates this enemy. So the power up, we're basically creating a fake power up. And one of the things we do is we want to make the enemy spawn. So then the enemy spawns. This is what the player is going to essentially collect, right? And I'll get into this in a second. So, but one of the other things that we do is that we wanted to play a little sound effect because the teleport opens. There's a little portal, and then the essentially the power up slides out of the portal. And then what else do we want to do? So there was this. And then we have, I think, yeah, so we have, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. 1 second. And I think, okay. All right. So cool. The other thing that, the anatomy of the stuff. Okay, cool. Yeah. So we spawn the enemy power up. And then we also, after a very short period of time, 0.2 seconds, we essentially spawn, I think it's this. Is it this? 1 second. We're here. Okay, 1 second. Let me pull this apart. Okay, so I was puzzling over this, essentially, the second countdown timer, and I think I actually doubled my logic here. So I did some tests where I can delete this, and it seems to still work. But all right, so back to where we're at. So basically, we have the main connected enemy state is alive. This comes down to the countdown timer. Countdown timer is set to stay activated. This then activates the enemy, right? And it also plays the sound effect for the teleport wave. So the portal opens up. And there's a few other things here that are part of this enemy type here. So we basically have an enemy, and this is our fake power up. So this is the visualization. If I show you, I'm going to come in here, and you can see here, this is an enemy. This is also an enemy. And the reason why they need to be enemy types is because we want to attach them to the camera because I wanted you to not be chasing power-ups, but more importantly, if you spawn a power-up, I didn't want it to start moving and then have you run into it and wind up collecting it. So, we did it for gameplay reasons, right? So I want you to get used to where they spawn and then realize, because it's a power down, I don't want you to grab them accidentally as much as possible. And that's also one of the reasons why you have a teleport kind of in the middle of the screen in an effect. I think players are going to get them by accident. I don't know. We're still playtesting. Anyways, I digress. So, what we wind up doing is we have an enemy type here. We have, it has collision in this case. And was there anything else special here? Nope. It's attached to camera. We talked about that. It plays a little particle system for the bits, and it also plays a sound when it spawns. So a little bit of a swoosh move sound. It's all just polish in this case. On the gameplay side, it's just 1 HP. And it's set collision-wise to be able to collide with the player, and the damage to player is set to 0. It's important. You don't want to damage the player. Maybe you do, but it's a different story. Different gameplay options. And then we make sure that it doesn't collide with player bullets, and it doesn't collide with enemy bullets. And then we hide when it's killed. And then also we check that if it's killed, it kills all attached entities, because we have some attached entities. And then we also have a little death power down despawn for that as well. So basically what happens is that when the player sees one of these bad boys, they can come over and collect it, and it looks like you've collected it. Okay, so the other thing that's important is that it spawns an item very briefly, and the power up is called the power up P downgrade. And I think it's items. All right, cool. And it's basically, I just use the same, you can't use the same exact asset, but I wanted one that was an item, and I made it visually the same, so then I know what's going on. So, and just so I can snap everything together. So we have an item here, and this item is also attached to the camera, and then... All right, I was just asking myself the question, why I wound up using an item spawned off an enemy, and the answer for that is currently in the engine. If we take a look at, because you can also do this, but unfortunately, and maybe there's a couple other ways you could probably do this a lot simpler, but I digress. So, you know, you always find better ways to do things at the end. This might be overly complicated, but basically the item spawner doesn't travel in the world with you. So now you potentially could, I'm pretty sure like there might be cases where you could spawn an item way far away in the world now that we have the ability to use the button. I haven't tested it and basically set it to infinite and basically turn up the speed to the highest possible. But that's why we wind up using an enemy in this particular case, because we always want to control where the item spawns from, and because we can't attach the gameplay item spawner logic, we don't have it attached to player, we don't have it attached to camera, we can't make it stick to the screen. This is why we had to work around that. So coming back to this, we have the item, and the item life is set to infinite in this case. It's got a little volume to it. It's got some other bells and whistles. It is attached to camera. And you see this very briefly. So collision like normal. And then more importantly here is on the gameplay side, you have the power up, and you want to give the value a negative number. In our case, we just want to go down 1 power level. Every 1 power level equals 1 weapon set for the player. So if you come over to your player, you go into your weapon sets. So I know that I think it either starts at 0 or it starts at 1. So, but if you gave the player 19 power levels, they would be at set 19, for instance, and vice versa. So this kind of gives you the ability to go backwards now and forwards through your weapon sets. You could also make life just easier for yourself, because you could potentially, especially when we get the next series of buttons, you could just hook up a gameplay trigger to the button to your player character and use a button to switch backwards and forwards through weapon sets. Also super interesting. So there's some interesting gameplay possibilities that are starting to come with the next version of the engine. Okay. So, but that's the main thing. I want to show you the item here. This is the secret sauce, and there's nothing else that's extra special there. So when the enemy dies, it essentially spawns a power-up P downgrade. And technically, you could play with these to give you, like, for instance, if you spawn multiples, you could then have different kinds of gameplay options. All right, so coming back to the core loop, so we were here, the enemy spawns, and then there are a couple other things that are important to know. So one is we have a trigger here, which is set to switch mode, and this is connected enemy state is all alive because we want to know when the enemy is now awake and alive. We start a timer. And this timer stays activated in this case, and the duration is 4.5 seconds. This basically is how long the enemy is going to live for. And then what happens after 4.5 seconds, we have a kill condition. So this is without score and item. This is super important because we only want the player to get the power downer if they collect the enemy by running into it, right? Collected the power up. The player doesn't know the difference. This is just us speaking in engine terms, right? So, and if the timer expires, we want to remove the power up in our case, and we don't want to spawn this item power downer. All right, and a couple other things happen. So one is we have here a countdown timer, which is also an enemy. And in this particular case, same thing. So the player can collide with it with damage player set to 0. I don't think that really matters in this case. I could turn that off. There's no collision because we don't need to collide with it. And again, making sure no score, no hit score. And I think that's all this does. So all that happens is that this enemy, when the enemy wakes up, it basically is a countdown timer. And basically at the end of this, we kind of fudged it a little bit to make sure that when it starts and ends, it basically with the with the animation here, we set the animation speed to 0.20. So it's a bit of a fudge, but this is where you're going to control how fast or how slow the countdown appears. And then so what we do is we align roughly the countdown timer itself with the enemy's animation state, and then we call a kill trigger after that timer's expired, and that both removes this enemy and this enemy at the same time. Also, the important thing here is that this enemy is attached. So you have the attachment system. So it's attached to the enemy. So, and that's why when this enemy is killed, you want to kill all attachments. It'll also kill this. So when the player runs into the fake power up, it will remove both of these elements. And then the last thing here is that we have essentially the teleport. Yeah, so there you go. And we basically, this can be freestanding, so it's very, very short in this particular case. As you can see here, I think if I enable it, yeah. So, and that is then attached to the fake enemy as well. So there we have a deterministic place where the portal appears, and all we did is have you can see here, if I just do this, you can see a little teleport. I mean, you can see how it's all aligned, basically all to be in the same spot. So it's very nice and very easy if you always set your center area for all of your different gameplay objects. And then you can do things like, so if it's DPK weapon portal down, so we go into the particle system and we go boop right here. So we have essentially a sprite sheet. It's a 2x2 that basically just does the rotation of the portal, the duration. We've fudged to kind of make it feel like it opens, and then the fake enemy power up comes out, and then it disappears. And then so we have basically it's about 0.6 seconds here, and then size and whatnot. So and then we only spawn one of these because we don't need multiple. It's set to burst, and we don't want it to keep retriggering. And then everything else is basically the same. So it's very, very simple in this particular case. So and then we also, I think we just have it disappear. Yeah, we just have it disappear. So we didn't need to do anything extra fancy there. And we set it to 2D as well, so it doesn't get any other, so it tracks like a 2D object. Okay, and then I think the only other thing that was important here is, was it? Where did I put that? Yeah, no, everything else is fine. So, and then so that basically gives us sort of the candy, right? Of the whole visual language of the portal opening, the fake item enemy spawner appearing, the fake item enemy spawner waiting for 4.5 seconds and then disappearing. And then that's probably the last thing here is we just added today. If you go to, so we added a new particle, which is powered down. Well, so there's an explosion called powered down death. So I'll show you that in a second. Go to the explosion editor. Okay, cool. And this is, you can see it here. Super, super, super simple. Simple, easy. We didn't want this thing to linger. We didn't want a long fade out, but we want a little something more than just it popping away. So all we did is essentially we added a particle element, and the particle element is the power downer. I recommend that you can change scale in all your different places in terms of the explosion editor and the particle system, and also the item spawner. I highly recommend you only change scale in one place. So it could be your particle system, and then what am I trying to say? So yeah, so if you change it there, you don't want to change it in two places. You don't want double scale, and then you can just leave scale at 1 here. And then time before start is 0, and then the duration is 0.25 seconds. And then if I go to the power, if I go to the particle system. All right, and power downer. Yeah, so, and then here, basically, yeah, so it's the same thing where it's a sprite sheet. The duration's there, very, very short. We changed the size here to be about 30. That kind of gives us about a 1-ish scale in engine for us with the way our assets come in. Max particles are set to 1, local space in this case. Also that can be set to burst. That should work. I just had a constant because I just got done adding it. So let's double check. Yep. And then you can see you have a little bit of a fade out. Okay, cool. So if your head's not exploding yet, that is the core logic. So we have all the key pieces, right? And now what we do is we have essentially, we have 19 of these that hang out and they travel with us through the level, and they're for every level. And then so the next fun piece, and this is some ancient crazy wisdom, right? So a really good programmer that I've known back in the day, he was a network programmer, and he basically always said that when you design something code-wise, always design it for at least 3 if you need that. Because if you program multiplayer network connectivity and you're only doing it with 2 players, by the time you put the 3rd player in, there were things that you didn't realize you needed to do communication wise between all 3 players that you're only doing in a by sync between 2 players. And then after 3, it doesn't matter as much because the programming pattern scales from that. So if it's 4 players or 5 or 40, the communication is basically very similar. There are differences, but that's a simplification. The main wisdom for you is when you design your things, if you need to have more than 1 iteration loop designed with multiples, at least 3 in mind first, that'll help you because then you can expand from there without having to then redo your logic. Because you always want to figure out your logic in little pieces. make sure you're building it up and that it works deterministically. And then from there, you then can layer on essentially your next layer of the logic. Okay, so with the exploded version here, so essentially what we have, the only difference is, so you know what all this does, is that where is it? 1 second. Okay, so we have this guy here. This is okay, cool. I think that here, let me pause it real quick. Okay, so the reason why I was explaining that is that, so from a larger perspective, to look at the whole of what we're doing, there's a slight difference between that first version and then all the subsequent versions. So looking at your button object, you can see here that all these button objects or all of the output connection points for the button object comes to all of these triggers, and the triggers for each group of elements, right? Because what we want to do is make sure that every time the player presses the button, that they essentially get one of these, and that it's finite, meaning that at some point you exhaust them, and we want it to spawn only one at a time. So then what we do is we come back up here. So different than where we had just that first bit here, and we have essentially our gameplay trigger here, which is the same as the other ones, and then we have this one difference here, right? So in all your subsequent versions, we have a gameplay trigger here that is set to switch mode. Connected enemy state is all dead. So that's again coming back to these bool enemies, right? So we're checking to see, did the player spawn this fake power up? If they did, then we kill essentially. So once it's activated here for switch mode, then we kill essentially this enemy condition. And so when the enemy is dead here, we say, okay, cool, this one's dead. Let's check. It is dead. Cool. Then we'll use this. We'll spawn this power up block. And so we do the same thing where once that power up block is spawned, we kill this bool enemy here. And then we go, cool, let's spawn the next one, and then so forth. So, and if you can take a look here, I'm in runtime, you get a sense for it. So that's the first one, the second one. And you can see here the, actually I can probably get in just a little closer. Probably put this back over here. Close enough. All right. We'll go into, by the way, pressing spacebar and be able to visually see what's happening with your logic. Super, super helpful for things like this. All right. So we spawn the first one, and then we spawn the second one. Technically, they're out of order, but you can see here that it kills the bool enemy. Kills the bool enemy, and so forth, right? So, and it's, I could spawn all of them if I want, but it's basically making sure that I have one button press per spawn. All right. Okay. Okay. So now let me show you the implementation. Now that you've got it, let me just double check. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. All right. So then what happens at the bottom here? Okay. So then we have one special piece of logic. Here, let me, here, I'll just do this. It's not really a special piece of logic. So when you iterate through all 19 power downers, the very final piece, and this is a conveyance thing for us, is we want to let the player know that they just don't have any more, right? Because if you have functionality on a button and you start pressing the button and there's no more functionality and there's no indication what's going on, then it's bad design. The player will think that your game is broken. So then what we have is at the very end of this, we have essentially the same kind of setup with the trigger condition, and we go, cool. When this guy is dead here, on an all dead, we basically do a couple things that are a little different. One is we have a debug text for us out of power downers, and then we also we continue to spawn the portal, because that's again visual feedback, and then we play a little negative sound effect here. So And the portal is the particle system. And then we have a sound object here. We switch mode, but play until the end. And then it's basically a negative sound effect. All right, cool. And let me take us over to the weapon room. Ooh, this is tough. This is a hard one. This took a couple days to get working with the input system and trying to solve and work around some of the current limitations we have in Shmup Creator to create this feature. Okay, cool. So I'll turn this on real quick so you can hear the soundos. Turn off the music. All right. So then what we do is we essentially took all of that logic and we collapsed it down because we want everything to spawn and behave exactly the same. Again, this is why it's super important to use and set your preferences, your grid and snap. So in this case, I find that showing the grid and grid spacing of 32 is quite helpful. And you can see here, right? So this is the increments. You can see it snapping. This is the increments in which the script object can be moved around on the grid, right? And you know, it helps with organization. I think that's super, super important. And then the other piece here, so that's grid snapping. And then you want to come up to here and you want to snap objects to the grid corners. So these are your grid bits. And yeah, there you go. Okay. So the reason why I was showing you that is because I essentially took, here's the dummy mover object. This is what makes all of the enemies. So if you see here, if I go into runtime preview, so if I move the camera, this is going to move the logic along with the player and the camera. Super important. And because again, we always want things to spawn at the same exact spot. Determinism is important for gameplay, right? Especially gameplay mechanics. And then what we have here is we have our little helper, which, you know, again, gameplay text is the power downer. We have our button press, as we already pointed out, the dummy mover, and every enemy type. Maybe I'll go back real quick. Go back to the test lab. Don't want to save. Because I didn't really cover this, and it's probably good to point out. Okay. Come back over here. And, all right. Essentially what we did is we collapsed all of our functionality into the same exact. So we stacked it on top of itself. Highly also recommend that when you have very complex chunks of logic, this is your layer system. And so you can turn off chunks, and this is my debug, but you can turn off chunks of functionality, but you can also essentially put everything on a similar layer, and then you can enable and disable. So if you ever need to come back and pull things apart, because as your scenes get more complex, you may need to be able to just want to look at your script, basically, right? Okay. So then what we wound up doing here is we just basically took each one of these and we bloop. I'm slightly off of, it's funny. I'm slightly off of the snap point. All right, let's try that. But anyways, you get the point. So I basically came in here and I brought all of these down and I collapsed them all into one chunk of functionality, right? And again, you can see here, we have the attachment system and everything gets parented to the dummy mover object. So, and you're using basically the attach system because we need it to all to move along with the player. All right. So now that I gave you an example of what that is and how we set that up, let me go back to the weapon room. Okay. So basically, as you can see that I already showed the functionality. So everything is now tidied up and put together, and then you're going to copy this across all of your levels so it's exactly the same and it behaves deterministically, right? And then really quick, there we go. I'm at the end of my power downers.
Weapons down.
And this is now when I press the button and I'm out of power downers. You can see that every time I press the button. Now, if you jam the button a bunch, or if you press and hold because it's set to press, you get a little bit of a negative sound effect, and you still get feedback on the button. Okay. That was very, very tough to explain. Very, very complex for me working through that. Again, there might be some better ways to do it, but this shows you that if you have an idea, especially with Shmup Creator, there are sometimes ways to get to that idea that may not be as easy to understand or to do kind of first and what am I trying to say? At first blush, it may not look like you can do it, but because of the flexibility of the enemy system, the way enemies and the particle systems work together, and some of the attachment stuff, you can actually build quite a few clever mechanics that are a little bit more complex, but could help you along the way. Again, it's more advanced in this particular case, but yeah, I hope that's helpful. And I don't think I missed anything. I think everything else is good. Yeah, okay. If you found this helpful and you have questions, I'll do my best to help you out. Feel free to leave the questions and feedback down in the comments. Thank you everyone that's been checking out the videos. It's been really fun to work with Shmup Creator and try to build some of these more I think advanced mechanics and gameplay features. It's the same thing. I got to do a video on a rank system and a bunch of other things that are a little more complex, but the engine is evolving. Sunny, big shout out to you and the Shmup Creator devs. We can do quite a bit more because of the flexibility of the engine in a lot of ways than we could before. And I think the next iterations, next year, it's going to be fantastic. The global variable system, the new variable system is going to be amazing. There's going to be a lot we can do in order to create new and more defining gameplay. And I think that we're on the right road for that. Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time.